It did not begin with an accusation. It began with a warning quietly delivered, carefully worded, and impossible to ignore. Inside one of the palace's most restricted rooms, the heir reportedly placed a sealed briefing before the king. No raised voices, no public confrontation. But when the meeting ended, staff noticed something unusual. Doors that normally stayed open suddenly closed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, almost nobody outside the inner administrative circles paid attention. Palace schedules continued. Engagement announcements moved forward. Public appearances remained measured and familiar. Yet according to reports and commentary circulating among royal observers, something had shifted beneath the carefully managed rhythm of royal life. Not publicly, not dramatically, quietly. And inside institutions built on routine, quiet changes often create the loudest questions. The concern, according to various interpretations of events, did not arrive all at once. It emerged gradually through conversations, internal briefings, and administrative observations that individually appeared ordinary but collectively began to form a pattern difficult to dismiss. Reports suggest Prince William had been receiving increasingly uneasy assessments connected not to scandal, not to public controversy, but to operational matters occurring behind the ceremonial curtain. Those familiar with how royal households function often describe them as worlds within worlds, carefully separated, carefully balanced, and governed by invisible boundaries that rarely attract public attention. Those boundaries exist for a reason. Influence is managed. Access is structured. Communication moves with intention. And when questions begin appearing about those structures, they are rarely treated lightly. According to Palace Watch reporting and various interpretations circulating among commentators, William did not react immediately. That in itself became part of the story. There were reportedly no dramatic declarations, no ultimatums, no emotional confrontations. Instead, there was restraint, conversations, requests for clarification, additional review, the kind of deliberate patience expected from someone raised inside an institution, where decisions are measured not in headlines but in consequences. Yet something eventually changed. Sources and public speculation describe a private audience being arranged with King Charles, an audience notable not because meetings between father and son are unusual, but because of its timing. The king had already been navigating a period defined by responsibility, scrutiny, and widely reported personal challenges. Observers repeatedly noted how determined he appeared to maintain continuity and avoid unnecessary internal turbulence, which made this meeting feel different. Reports suggest William framed the discussion carefully, not as accusation, not as conflict, but as concern. Concern about processes, concern about oversight, concern that certain administrative questions, if ignored, could eventually become larger than anyone intended. That distinction mattered, because those close to royal tradition often argue that the monarchy protects itself not by assuming wrongdoing, but by verifying trust. And according to various interpretations, that principle became central to what happened next. The meeting itself remains private. No official account exists. No statement was issued. But speculation intensified after staff reportedly noticed subtle procedural changes in the days that followed. Access patterns appeared different. Certain consultations reportedly became more structured. Administrative channels that had long operated informally were, according to observers, suddenly being revisited. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger headlines. Everything unusual enough to invite questions. Inside institutions where continuity is the highest priority, even small procedural shifts carry meaning. Some dismissed it as routine governance. Others interpreted it as something more deliberate. Not punishment. Not confrontation. Verification. And that single distinction transformed palace whispers into something far more difficult to ignore. Because a warning alone does not trigger a palace response unless it touches something far more sen for years, the office operated quietly out of headlines, out of scrutiny, and largely outside public curiosity. That was precisely why attention turning toward it felt so unexpected. If the previous developments created discomfort, what came next created something more dangerous: curiosity. Not public curiosity at first, institutional curiosity, the kind that does not announce itself, does not leak immediately, and does not move with urgency unless someone believes the cost of waiting may become greater than the cost of asking difficult questions. Royal offices, according to long-standing tradition and public understanding of palace operations, are rarely treated as simple workplaces. They are not ordinary administrative departments. They become extensions of influence, guardians of schedules, gatekeepers of access, interpreters of priorities, and in some cases, quiet architects of reputation itself. Titles may carry public attention, but offices carry momentum. They decide what moves, what pauses, what reaches the sovereign, and what quietly disappears before anyone notices. That was why attention shifting toward one private office, an institution that had reportedly operated for years with little public discussion, felt unusual even to seasoned observers. Reports and commentary suggested this was not a story about dramatic misconduct or explosive revelations, at least not at first. Instead, questions reportedly emerged in a far less sensational way. Process, procedure, patterns, small things. Administrative observers, according to various interpretations, began examining whether certain channels had become increasingly informal over time. Not improper, not unlawful, simply different from expected convention. And inside royal systems, different can become significant very quickly. Those familiar with palace structures often describe royal households as separate but interconnected worlds, each with its own culture, priorities, and internal rhythm. That arrangement works best when boundaries remain clear. But according to commentary circulating among insiders and royal analysts, differing priorities had gradually begun emerging between households. One side reportedly emphasized continuity and tighter institutional coordination. Another appeared, at least in interpretation, to favor flexibility, trusted relationships, and informal influence. Neither approach automatically suggested conflict, but overlap creates pressure, and pressure creates questions. According to speculation surrounding the internal review, reviewers were not searching for scandal. That distinction became increasingly important as palace discussion intensified. There were reportedly no expectations of secret fortunes, hidden agreements, or dramatic betrayals. What they wanted to understand was simpler. Who had visibility? Who had access? Who influenced what reached decision-makers? And had routines quietly evolved into assumptions no one had formally approved? That possibility changed everything. Because once attention turned toward channels instead of outcomes, ordinary administrative choices suddenly carried new meaning. Meetings became points of discussion. Communication habits attracted renewed interest. Informal conversations that once seemed harmless began appearing in a different context. Not because anyone had declared a problem existed, but because nobody could confidently say where influence began and where procedure ended. That uncertainty spread quietly. Some staff reportedly viewed the review as ordinary institutional maintenance. Others began wondering whether something larger was unfolding beneath the language of administration. Questions led to clarification. Clarification led to mapping. Mapping led to uncomfortable realizations. And slowly, almost invisibly, the review appeared to evolve from understanding process into understanding relationships. Because institutions rarely become unsettled by dramatic moments. They become unsettled when people start asking why things became normal in the first place. And the deeper officials looked, the less the concern appeared to be about paperwork, and more about power. Citive, then reputation. No announcement. No cameras. Just a sequence of internal instructions that, in palace terms, carried extraordinary weight. What had begun as private concern and cautious verification now entered a different phase entirely. Not public action. Not disciplinary action. Something quieter and, according to palace observers, potentially more consequential. Because inside institutions built on continuity, the most serious decisions rarely arrive with spectacle. They arrive through process. Reports and interpretations surrounding the period suggest that King Charles, after receiving concerns and allowing preliminary internal discussions to unfold, authorized what was described not as an investigation, but as a limited review. The language mattered. Every word mattered. Review, assessment, verification. Terms chosen carefully enough to avoid signaling crisis, yet deliberate enough to signal that attention had shifted from informal observation into formal oversight. That distinction became central almost immediately. Commentators close to royal affairs reportedly emphasize that internal reviews are not declarations of wrongdoing. They exist because institutions survive by testing systems before systems are tested by circumstances. In that interpretation, governance was not an admission of failure, it was proof that procedures still mattered. Yet reassurance did not produce calm. It produced questions. Because timing changes meaning. Observers noted that the authorization appeared to arrive during a period already defined by unusual pressure and heightened sensitivity around continuity, responsibility, and the future shape of the institution. That context transformed what might otherwise have been viewed as routine administration into something people could not stop interpreting. Inside palace circles, according to speculation and reporting traditions surrounding royal administration, the announcement itself was less memorable than its speed. Requests moved faster. Meetings appeared more structured. Consultations reportedly widened. Staff who expected gradual adjustments instead found themselves responding to accelerated timelines. Not panic, but urgency. And urgency inside palace structures tends to attract attention. Some reportedly welcomed the move as disciplined leadership. Others quietly asked a different question. If this was only procedural, why now? That question spread carefully at first, then more broadly. Aides whispered. Commentators speculated. Royal observers attempted to interpret what authority was actually being exercised and where its boundaries ended. Because beneath the administrative language sat something far more delicate. Who has the right to review whom? Royal households may operate within the same institution, but they do not function identically. Their responsibilities overlap while their identities remain distinct. That arrangement depends on respect, custom, and lines that are often understood more than written. And according to various interpretations, those lines had suddenly become the subject of discussion. Was this simply a sovereign ensuring operational clarity? Was it the heir preparing for future responsibility? Or had concern over process quietly evolved into concern over influence itself? As speculation intensified, one phrase reportedly began appearing among Palace Watch commentary and internal interpretation, a phrase that gave structure to what otherwise felt impossible to define. The Crown Continuity Review. Not a legal doctrine, not an official decree, but a symbolic idea. The belief that continuity must be examined before it can be protected. And once that phrase entered the conversation, everything that followed started being viewed through a different lens. Routine decisions no longer looked routine. Procedural changes no longer felt procedural. Questions became expectations. Expectations became pressure. And if the review was expected to calm concerns, the effect inside the palace was exactly the opposite. Royal institutions are built to project continuity. But continuity becomes difficult when competing visions begin occupying the same corridors. By the time discussions surrounding the review reached broader palace awareness, something subtle had already changed. The questions were no longer limited to procedure. They had become questions of philosophy. Quietly at first, carefully, but enough to create an atmosphere that observers later described not as conflict, but as tension held in perfect control. Because institutions do not become unsettled only when rules are broken. Sometimes they become unsettled when different people begin imagining different futures. Reports and interpretations surrounding the period increasingly pointed toward an uncomfortable reality. There may never have been a single disagreement. There may instead have been competing ideas about how influence should function inside a modern monarchy. One approach emphasized preservation, clear lines, structured access, deliberate distance between administration and personal relationships. Another appeared, at least through the lens of speculation and commentary, to place greater value on adaptability, trusted networks, and responsiveness inside an institution facing a changing public landscape. Neither philosophy sounded unreasonable. That was what made the moment so difficult. Because there was no obvious villain, no public rupture, only the growing awareness that two ideas of continuity might not always move at the same speed. Inside palace circles, according to various interpretations, staff began feeling the pressure long before the public sensed anything unusual, not because instructions became impossible, but because uncertainty creates its own weight. Conversations reportedly became more careful. Routine approvals felt more deliberate. Questions that once received immediate answers now sometimes returned with additional layers of review. People adapted. But adaptation has a cost, and the longer uncertainty lasted, the more noticeable that cost became. Outside palace walls, however, nothing appeared different. Schedules continued. Public statements remained measured. Appearances projected steadiness. Observers remarked repeatedly on how composed everyone seemed. And perhaps that contrast made the speculation stronger. Because institutions built on continuity rarely reveal strain openly. They absorb it. Until eventually people begin wondering whether calm is genuine or simply disciplined. At the center of all this sat King Charles, and according to commentary surrounding the period, his position may have been the most difficult of all. A sovereign is expected to preserve stability, but leadership also demands accountability. Too little oversight risks criticism. Too much oversight risks creating the very instability one hopes to prevent. Reports and interpretations increasingly describe Charles not as choosing sides, but as carrying two responsibilities at once: protect relationships while protecting the institution that outlives them. That balancing act became harder as expectations shifted. Because while the king appeared focused on maintaining cohesion, another figure slowly began occupying a different role in public interpretation. William, not as challenger, not as reformer, but increasingly as guardian. Commentators and palace watch observers began describing his actions less as intervention and more as stewardship, an attempt to ensure that structures remain stronger than personalities. That perception changed the atmosphere. Questions about oversight became questions about succession. Conversations about process became conversations about continuity. And once that happened, every quiet adjustment suddenly felt larger than itself. Staff noticed. Observers noticed. Even silence began attracting interpretation. Because people were no longer asking what was being reviewed. They were asking what future was being protected. And in institutions shaped by history, that question has a way of changing everything. Then came the moment observers would later describe as the turning point. When expectations rise high enough, sometimes the most shocking outcome is not discovery but absence. By the time anticipation surrounding the review reached its peak, expectations had quietly transformed into assumptions. Observers expected exposure. Commentators expected dramatic conclusions. Staff reportedly prepared themselves for a defining institutional moment. After weeks of speculation, many seemed convinced the review would uncover something concrete, something decisive enough to explain the unusual caution, the accelerated consultations, and the growing language of continuity and oversight. But according to interpretations that began circulating afterward, what emerged was not scandal. It was ambiguity. And ambiguity can sometimes create more tension than certainty ever could. Reports suggested that the review, in its limited form, did not uncover wrongdoing. There were no explosive findings, no dramatic declarations, no formal accusations. Instead, attention reportedly settled on something more difficult to explain and far harder to summarize. Procedural inconsistencies, not violations, not misconduct, differences in practice, areas where informal habits may have evolved faster than formal structures. To some, that distinction changed everything. To others, it changed nothing. Because once people expect revelation, moderation can feel almost unsettling. Inside palace interpretation, according to various accounts and commentary, reactions split almost immediately. One group reportedly viewed the outcome as proof that the institution had worked exactly as intended. Questions had been raised. Oversight had been exercised. Procedures had been reviewed. The absence of serious findings became, in their eyes, evidence that discipline still existed beneath public silence. Their argument was simple. Strong institutions do not wait for failure. They verify before failure arrives. But another interpretation began taking shape. Some observers quietly argued that the review had revealed something equally important, not wrongdoing, but friction between old systems and changing expectations. They suggested the issue had never been about individuals. It had been about structure. Processes built for one era now being asked to operate in another. Relationships carrying responsibilities that had expanded over time. Informal channels succeeding operationally while creating uncertainty institutionally. From that perspective, the review was not a conclusion. It was a warning. Not that something had gone wrong, but that clarity had become overdue. And suddenly the conversation shifted again. People stopped asking what had been found. They started asking what should happen now. Inside palace circles, according to interpretation and speculation, that shift created a new kind of pressure because uncertainty can be tolerated for a time. But unresolved uncertainty begins demanding leadership, which placed Charles in a position that could no longer remain entirely private. Until now, restraint had defined the response. Careful language, limited action, quiet process. But the atmosphere surrounding the review reportedly made visible leadership unavoidable. Not because there was crisis, because there was expectation. Observers increasingly looked toward the king not for answers, but for direction. Would continuity mean preservation? Would continuity mean adjustment? Would leadership reassure through stability or strengthen itself through reform? And perhaps that became the deepest irony of all. The review had not delivered certainty. It had created choice. Because once systems are examined, they are rarely seen the same way again. And those expecting a dramatic ending misunderstood what was unfolding. The documents had never been the story. The review had never been the destination. But the real consequence was never about documents, it was about what happened next. For years, William had prepared for responsibility. Few expected preparation to arrive in the form of quiet intervention. By the time the review reached its uneasy conclusion, the conversation inside and outside palace circles had already started changing shape. Attention was no longer fixed on findings. It shifted towards something less tangible, and in some ways more consequential: the meaning behind who had acted, when they had acted, and what that revealed about the future. Because preparation inside a monarchy rarely announces itself. It accumulates. Years of observation. Years of restraint. Years of learning where influence ends and responsibility begins. And according to the growing interpretation among commentators and palace observers, what many people had once viewed as distance now began to look more like patience. William's role in the unfolding events increasingly attracted a different kind of attention. Not because he appeared to seek visibility, but because visibility appeared to find him. Reports and commentary suggested that his approach had remained consistent from the beginning. Raise concern carefully, preserve process, avoid spectacle, and allow institutions to function without becoming the story themselves. That approach did not generate headlines at first, but after the review, it began generating something more powerful: reinterpretation. Observers started revisiting earlier decisions, earlier appearances, earlier moments that once seemed routine. Actions previously dismissed as caution suddenly looked deliberate. The language of continuity appeared more intentional. Administrative discipline appeared less procedural and more strategic. Questions that once sounded simple became more layered. Had preparations for future responsibility already shaped present decisions? Had succession planning quietly evolved into shared governance? Or had people simply begun noticing patterns that had always existed? The answers remained uncertain, but the perception grew. And perception inside institutions often becomes reality long before official language catches up. At the center of that shift stood a contrast that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Succession planning belongs to tomorrow. Governance belongs to today. Yet according to public interpretation surrounding the period, those two timelines appeared to move closer together than many expected. Charles remained sovereign. That never appeared in question. But observers increasingly described an atmosphere of coordination rather than separation. The king represented continuity through authority. William appeared to represent continuity through preparation, not replacement. Alignment. That distinction mattered, because alignment creates stability, and stability was becoming the most valuable currency in the room. Reports and speculation increasingly framed interactions not as generational competition, but as institutional synchronization. One preserving the weight of office, the other preparing for the weight to one day continue. And slowly, the narrative moved away from individuals altogether. That may have been the most unexpected development. What began as concern over process gradually became a broader conversation about principle. Continuity over personality, structures over preferences, responsibility over perception, the institution before any single figure inside it. For some, that interpretation felt reassuring. For others, unsettling. Because if continuity becomes the central value, then every decision begins carrying a longer shadow than the moment itself. And perhaps that was why so many observers felt something had changed even without dramatic announcements. No declarations were made. No victories were claimed. No one appeared eager to define what had happened. Yet people noticed the same thing. The language softened. The movement slowed. The structure seemed steadier. And in that silence, conclusions began forming on their own. Yet the strongest message would come not through speeches, but through silence. After weeks of speculation, there was no dramatic announcement, only subtle changes that those closest to royal life immediately recognized. That was the moment many people missed. Not because it lacked importance. Quite the opposite. It was missed because people had spent weeks preparing for something louder. A statement, a confrontation, a symbolic reset. Instead, what emerged appeared quieter than expected and, for that reason, more difficult to interpret. No sweeping declarations followed. No visible restructuring was publicly emphasized. No language suggested victory, defeat, correction, or vindication. Yet according to observers and interpretations that circulated afterward, something had undeniably shifted. The institution appeared to exhale, and institutions rarely exhale unless pressure has changed. Reports and commentary increasingly suggested that the aftermath was defined by recalibration, rather than reaction. Internal structures reportedly became more clearly defined. Administrative pathways appeared more intentional. Conversations that had once moved through habit now seemed to move through renewed clarity. Not restriction, not expansion. Definition. That distinction became important because the absence of dramatic outcomes forced people to pay attention to details. Who attended what? Which processes appeared more formal? How responsibilities were described? The language surrounding operations reportedly became more precise not because chaos had existed before, but because ambiguity had become harder to tolerate. Some interpreted these adjustments as ordinary governance finally becoming visible. Others saw something more deliberate, a quiet reaffirmation that institutions remain strongest when procedures outlive personalities. And slowly, the atmosphere began changing. Public attention, which had briefly drifted toward speculation and internal interpretation, started moving back toward familiar themes. Duty, continuity, service. The language of monarchy returned to the language of routine. Official appearances continued. Schedules resumed their rhythm. Commentary softened, not because every question had been answered, but because institutions often restore confidence not through explanation, but through repetition. Inside palace circles, however, interpretations remained more complicated. According to various readings of the period, staff did not leave with identical conclusions. Some reportedly viewed the review and its aftermath as a necessary moment of modernization, proof that long-standing systems could adapt without losing themselves. Others saw something entirely different. To them, the process became evidence that discipline still mattered, that structure remained intact, and that continuity had defended itself without requiring spectacle. Neither interpretation fully defeated the other, and perhaps that became the point. Because institutions survive not when everyone agrees. They survive when disagreement remains inside boundaries people still respect. Over time, speculation gradually lost momentum. Theories became quieter. Questions became broader. People who once searched for hidden conclusions began noticing something simpler. Nothing had collapsed. Nothing had dramatically transformed. And yet somehow the atmosphere no longer felt exactly the same. The palace projected what it always seeks to project: unity. Not perfect agreement. Not identical thinking. Unity. And for many observers, that may have become the strongest statement of all. Because in the end, the institution had not responded by choosing personalities. It responded by choosing continuity. Which left one final question hanging over everything that came before. And in the end, one question remained. What had this really been about? History rarely remembers meetings. It remembers what those meetings protected, or what they failed to preserve. And perhaps that was always the misunderstanding. For weeks, attention had moved from room to room, from interpretation to interpretation, from speculation to silence. People searched for defining moments. They searched for hidden outcomes. They searched for a winner and a loser, for proof of conflict, for a single decisive event that would explain why quiet procedural shifts had suddenly become the center of so much attention. But history rarely works that way. History tends to return to smaller moments. A warning delivered carefully, a concern raised privately, a decision delayed until delay no longer felt responsible. And when the story is examined from a distance, what becomes visible is not confrontation, but pressure. That opening moment, the one that seemed so insignificant compared to everything that followed, now appears different. The warning was never presented as accusation. That mattered. Because accusations divide. Warnings protect, and according to the interpretations that followed, protection may have been the deeper instinct driving every step afterward. Not protection of status, not protection of image, protection of continuity. Throughout the speculation, one idea repeatedly returned beneath the surface. Institutions carry responsibilities larger than the people temporarily standing inside them. That idea is uncomfortable. It asks individuals to accept limits. It asks relationships to coexist with structure. It asks authority to welcome scrutiny rather than fear it. And perhaps that was why this moment resonated far beyond any review or procedural adjustment. Because it became a reminder that stability and examination are not opposites. Strong institutions are not strengthened by avoiding questions. They are strengthened by surviving them. Reports faded. Interpretations softened. Urgency slowly gave way to routine. Yet something remained. Not tension. Perspective. A growing recognition that continuity does not mean resisting change, and it does not mean embracing every new impulse. It means carrying responsibility carefully enough that trust survives transitions. That burden may have rested most heavily on Charles. According to the broader interpretation that emerged, his final position never appeared centered on choosing personalities or rewarding perspectives. It appeared centered on preserving trust. Trust in process. Trust in restraint. Trust that institutions remain strongest when they respond with discipline, instead of emotion. And perhaps that became the quiet conclusion hidden inside all the noise. No declarations were required. No public correction became necessary. No dramatic ending arrived. Only a recalibration, a reminder, a return to principles that institutions depend on but rarely explain. For William, preparation appeared to continue. For the wider palace, rhythm returned. For observers, conclusions remained open. And maybe that is exactly why the story lingers. Not because something extraordinary happened, but because something ordinary was taken seriously before it became extraordinary. That may never satisfy those who wanted scandal. But institutions are not remembered for how loudly they respond. They are remembered for what they choose to protect. And in the quiet that followed, perhaps the clearest message of all finally emerged. Continuity is not built in moments of celebration. It is built in moments of restraint. Because institutions are rarely tested by public storms, they are tested by what happens behind closed doors. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.